You're tuned in to Ghost Frequency. Tonight, our signal drifts deep into the Appalachian wilderness, a land wrapped in fog and folklore, where the line between myth and reality fades with the setting sun. These mountains remember everything, every scream that echoed through the trees, every shadow that moved when it shouldn't have, every story that locals refused to repeat after dark. In this transmission, we uncover 9 true encounters with something ancient and predatory that still stalks the hollows and ridgelines of Appalachia. These are not tales told for thrill. They're drawn from first-hand accounts, verified reports, and the fragmented memories of people who barely escaped alive. The details differ, but the patterns are the same, and they point to something that has always been here. Names and exact locations have been concealed to protect the living, but what they saw cannot be hidden. What you're about to hear is real, and once you know what walks beneath these mountains, you'll never listen to the woods the same way again. If this is your first time tuning in, subscribe to Ghost Frequency and keep your notifications on. The forest is restless tonight, and it's waiting for you to listen. The Henderson family had anchored themselves to the same hollow for 4 generations, nestled deep between the ridges of eastern Kentucky. It was a place where the rumble of coal trucks had long since faded, and the signal bars of cell phones never dared to appear. Their home, a weathered sentinel of timber, sat at the end of a gravel track that snaked through dense stands of oak and maple, so far from civilization that the nearest neighbor required a 20-minute hike through the dense woods. Marcus Henderson had absorbed the old stories with his grandmother's milk. Warnings of things that prowled the mountains after the last sliver of sun vanished. Creatures that could steal familiar faces, mimic trusted voices, and lure you into the darkness. He'd always dismissed them as the superstitions of a secluded people, until the autumn his younger brother David simply vanished. David, barely 17, was as stout as an ox and knew those mountains better than any grown man. He'd gone hunting alone on the ridge above their property, a ritual he'd performed countless times before. But as the last light bled from the sky, David didn't return. Marcus and his father, an unspoken dread hardening their faces, organized a search party with the local volunteer fire department. They found his rifle propped meticulously against a white oak, fully loaded. His hunting pack hung neatly from a nearby branch, and at the base of the tree, David's worn boots sat side by side, laces tied, as if he had simply stepped out of them and melted, barefoot, into the forest. No tracks, no blood, not a single sign of struggle. For 3 agonizing weeks, the search continued. Then, the authorities packed up, leaving the Hendersons with nothing but echoing questions and a hollow ache that deepened with each passing silent day. The first time Marcus heard David's voice after the disappearance, he was splitting firewood behind the house. A heavy gray October evening was settling in, the sun already swallowed by the western ridge. The air bit with a crispness that promised an early winter. He was gathering an armload of split oak when it drifted down from the tree line above the house. Faint, but unmistakable. David, calling his name. The same way he had called it 1,000 times throughout their childhood, carrying that slight, boyish crack in his voice that had never fully matured. Marcus froze, the logs tumbling from his arms. He stood perfectly still, listening, the silence of the hollow amplifying the drumming of his own heart. The voice came again, clearer this time, urgent, the tone David used when he was excited, or when he genuinely needed help. Marcus shouted back, his voice tearing through the stillness, echoing off the surrounding hills. Only silence answered. He tried to rationalize it, to blame grief, the peculiar acoustics of the mountains, how familiar sounds could distort into something unrecognizable. But over the following weeks, the voice returned. more frequently, more insistently. Always at dusk, always from the tree line, always calling his name with that same desperate, pleading urgency. Marcus searched, flashlight beam cutting futile paths through the thick darkness until his batteries died, and his father, his face a mask of worry, would come looking for him. His mother began to fret about his judgment, suggesting he speak to the pastor at the small Baptist church down in the valley. Marcus nodded, feigning agreement, but he knew intrinsically that what he was hearing was real. As November draped the mountains in a cold gray shroud, the voice began to subtly shift. Where it had once been an exact replica of David's, now minute differences began to prickle Marcus's skin. The cadence was wrong too slow, as if each word had to be carefully weighed before being uttered. Sometimes an eerie echo would accompany it, as if multiple voices were attempting to synchronize, to mimic a tone and rhythm they couldn't quite grasp. The worst was when his name was elongated, stretched into an unnatural, drawn-out wail that seemed to hang in the frigid air long after it should have dissipated. Marcus stopped responding. But the calls did not cease. They grew bolder, creeping closer to the house with each passing night. Everything changed on a moonless December night. Marcus lay in bed, the drumming of rain against his window pane a rhythmic counterpoint to his unease, when he heard David's voice directly outside his bedroom. Not from the distant tree line, but speaking in a conversational tone, just beyond the thin walls of the old farmhouse. The voice recounted a story. The day they'd stumbled upon the old mine shaft, up on Black Mountain, recalling details only David would know, speaking in the exact rhythmic pattern David always adopted when animated by an adventure. But there was a fundamental wrongness to the words themselves, as if something that had never been human was struggling to recall the very essence of human memory and emotion. Marcus slid out of bed, creeping toward the window, acutely aware of every creak of the old floorboards. Through the rain-streaked glass, he saw a figure in the yard below, barely perceptible in the oppressive darkness. It was the correct height, the right build for David. It wore the familiar flannel shirt and worn jeans David had been wearing the day he disappeared. But the figure stood too still. Its arms hung motionless at its sides in a way that defied natural repose, like a marionette awaiting its puppeteer's command. The voice continued its rambling narrative, yet the figure's mouth remained perfectly still. A chilling realization washed over Marcus. The sound emanated from somewhere else entirely, perhaps from the deeper woods, while this thing stood, silent and motionless, in the rain. Marcus watched, suspended in a waking nightmare that stretched for what felt like hours. The figure never twitched, never shifted its weight, impervious to the cold rain soaking its clothes. Then a flash of lightning tore across the sky, momentarily illuminating the yard in stark, brutal detail. Marcus caught a glimpse of its face. His breath hitched in his throat. From a distance, it was David, but the features were subtly, horrifyingly wrong, as if an amateur sculptor had tried to recreate his brother's face from a fading memory and distorted the proportions. The eyes were too vast, the mouth too wide, and when the thing finally turned its head, slowly, to stare directly at Marcus's window, its eyes reflected the lightning not with a human spark, but with the cold, unfeeling glint of an animal's. The next morning, Marcus found tracks in the mud where the figure had stood. They were human-shaped, but deeply unsettling. The toes were elongated, the heel unnaturally narrow, and they pressed into the earth with a depth that suggested a weight far beyond what the figure appeared to possess. Following the tracks toward the tree line, Marcus saw them transform. With each step away from the house, they became less human, blurring into something monstrous, more akin to the paw prints of a large predator, complete with long, gouging claw marks extending beyond each digit. Marcus began to arm himself. He carried his grandfather's old Winchester rifle, flashlight with extra batteries, always. He rigged motion sensor lights around the property and convinced his father to let him board up the lower windows, citing a sudden fear of break-ins. The true reason: he had begun to see the David thing even in daylight, lurking just inside the deepest shadows of the tree line, those unnaturally large eyes fixated on the house. Sometimes there were more than one, each wearing David's face, but standing in subtly different poses, as if multiple entities were attempting to perfect a single ghastly disguise. The confrontation came on a moonless December night. Marcus was checking the locks, an etched ritual before bed, when he heard David's voice from the front porch. This time, it held the warm, familiar tone of childhood, asking Marcus to come outside, that he had something important to show him. The voice was perfect. No strange echoes, no unnatural rhythms. For a fleeting moment, Marcus felt his resolve falter, his hand hovering over the latch, before rational thought slammed back into place. This was not his brother. And whatever it was, it wanted him out of the sanctuary of the house. Marcus grabbed his rifle, crept to the front window, and peered through a gap in the boards he'd nailed over the glass. The David thing stood on the porch, so close Marcus could have reached out and touched it, were it not for the barrier between them. It looked more like David than ever before, yet something in its posture betrayed a barely contained violence, a coiled tension in its limbs that spoke of a predator ready to spring. When it spoke again, urging Marcus to open the door, its mouth now moved in perfect synchronization with the words. But the voice still seemed to emanate from multiple directions at once, as if the very woods themselves were speaking through it. Marcus raised the Winchester, aiming at the creature's center mass, his hands trembling despite years of hunting experience. The moment the rifle's iron sight found its mark, the David thing snapped its head toward the window, a blur of motion that defied the human eye. David's familiar face, once comforting, began to melt like wax, features dissolving into something primal and grotesque. The skin stretched, mottled gray, peeling back to reveal an underlying horror Marcus's mind fought to reject. Eyes distended, darkening to bottomless wells, while the mouth stretched into a rictus grin, a cavernous maw bristling with far too many teeth. A sound tore from its throat. David's laugh at first, then curdling into a growl, a shriek that clawed at the air, endless and impossible. It launched itself at the boarded window, a visceral projectile of malice. Claws raked wood, shrieking against the planks, desperate to tear through. Marcus, heart hammering, fired. The rifle's report deafened him, a concussive shock in the confined space. From outside, an ear-splitting wail erupted, then silence, a terrifying absolute quiet. When, after what felt like an eternity, he forced himself to peer through the splintered boards, the porch lay empty. Only dark, viscous stains marred the moonlight-drenched planks. He never saw the David thing again, not in the flesh. But its voice, a chilling siren call, echoed from the woods. Sometimes it wore David's timbre, sometimes his mother's, sometimes his deceased grandmother's. Marcus never answered, never went out alone after dusk. They eventually sold the property, seeking refuge in town, where streetlights pushed back the encroaching shadows, and the hum of civilization drowned out the insidious whispers from the darkness. Still, Marcus sometimes woke, listening, convinced he heard his name, spoken by something that wore the faces of those he loved, but held only malice in its heart. The old-timers in Breaker's Bluff spoke of a thin veil, a place where worlds bled together, where hidden things sometimes breached the boundary to walk among the living. These creatures, they warned, fed on grief and longing, twisting memories into bait, luring the lost into an inescapable darkness. Marcus knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that his brother David was truly gone. Taken by something that mimicked him so perfectly, he'd almost followed it into the woods. Almost. That sliver of doubt, that hairline crack in the illusion, had been his salvation. Lena Caldwell was cut from different cloth. At 16, she was captain of Pikeville High's cross-country team, all lean muscle and stubborn will. Her grandmother's mountain superstitions were often met with an eye roll and a dismissive laugh. Quaint, but ultimately baseless, rational, scientific. She believed in what she could see, what she could measure. So when her grandmother cautioned against running alone after sunset, particularly in winter when the veil grew thin, Lena would offer a quick kiss, promise care, and then continue her routine, unwavering. December in Appalachia brought a brutal, early darkness. With state championships 6 weeks away, Lena pushed herself, piling on extra miles. Her usual route along an old logging road, winding through dense pine forests, then looping back via punishing switchbacks, was etched into her memory. She'd run it hundreds of times, in all weather, at any hour. Every route, every rock, every turn. The night everything changed, a mandatory team meeting had kept her late. By the time she'd changed, the western ridge was already swallowing the sun, painting the sky in a fleeting, bruised palette of orange and purple she was too focused to notice. Her headlamp cut a narrow, anemic beam through the deepening twilight as she plunged into the woods, concentrating on breath and pace. The air grew frigid, her breath pluming in frosty clouds. The first mile passed uneventfully, her feet finding their familiar rhythm on the packed earth. The second mile pulled her deeper, the forest canopy swallowing the last vestiges of daylight, rendering her headlamp her sole communion with visibility. It was during the third mile, cresting a small rise just before the descent toward Pine Creek, that she heard it, a faint, pitiful whimper. Almost lost beneath her steady cadence, it grew distinct, a medium-sized dog in unmistakable distress. The sound was a hook, designed to catch anyone with a heart. Lena slowed, calling out into the darkness, a question on her lips. The whimpering stopped. Abruptly. A silence pressed in, heavy and absolute. She stood motionless for several minutes, listening, but heard nothing beyond the distant murmur of Pine Creek. Her mind offered rationalizations, imagination, a fox, some wild creature. She resumed her run, a nagging unease settling in. Then, minutes later, the whimpering resumed. Closer this time. More urgent. Lena stopped again, sweeping her headlamp beam through the trees. Bare trunks, tangled undergrowth. Nothing. Yet the crying continued, seemingly paralleling her course, moving through the forest. It was Buster, the Mitchell's golden retriever. 3 weeks missing. The entire neighborhood had searched. Against every instinct, every rational fiber, Lena left the trail, pushing through the undergrowth, calling Buster's name, murmuring reassurances. The whimpering stayed just ahead, a macabre Pied Piper, drawing her deeper, away from the familiar safety of the logging road. Branches tore at her jacket, thorns snagged her legs. But she pressed on, convinced she was rescuing a beloved pet. The thought of reuniting Buster with the Mitchells fueled her, silencing the small, insistent voice in her mind, a voice her grandmother would have recognized. 10 minutes of pushing through the undergrowth. An eternity. Lena broke into a small clearing, moonlight filtering through skeletal branches. The whimpering ceased. But now she heard something else, a movement in the dead leaves on the far side. Large enough for a golden retriever, yet subtly wrong. She called Buster's name, an answering whine. She turned her headlamp to the sound. Her blood froze. The creature standing at the edge of the clearing was roughly canine-shaped, golden retriever-sized, but its proportions were distorted, horrifying. Legs too long, ending not in paws, but malformed human-like hands, fingers elongated into claws. The head, basically canine, was unnervingly stretched upward, a grotesque parody of Buster's familiar silhouette. But it was the eyes that truly arrested her, reflecting her headlamp's beam with an intelligence that was chillingly human, staring with an unnerving, hungry anticipation. It opened its mouth. Another whimper, perfectly rendered, yet utterly alien, tearing from a throat clearly not designed for such sounds. Lena took an involuntary step back. The creature's mouth stretched into something akin to a grin, revealing teeth that were neither dog nor human, but a nightmarish fusion. It took a step forward, fluid grace flowing through its unnatural limbs. Lena knew then. She had been lured. Deliberately. This was not Buster. She turned and ran, body plowing through the undergrowth, heedless of the branches that tore at her clothes, at her skin. Behind her she heard it follow, not the soft padding of paws, but a rustle, an unnatural speed and agility. Occasionally another whimper, a whine. But now it was mockery. As if the thing savored her terror, letting her know its earlier distress had been nothing but a performance. She reached the logging road, turned toward home, pushing herself beyond any competitive limit. Lungs screamed, legs burned, yet fear propelled her with a superhuman, desperate endurance. The creature paralleled her, sometimes a gray shadow flitting between trees, sometimes hidden, but always audible, crashing through the underbrush. Twice she heard what sounded like Buster's bark, yet too deep, too resonant, as if coming from a chest cavity far too vast for any dog. As she ran, other sounds began to join the chase. A cacophony of whimpers and barks now assaulted Lena from every direction, as if a spectral pack had materialized around her in the winter woods. The sounds ahead, behind, on both sides, wove a disorienting web of false distress. She realized, with a chill severing the last tendrils of hope, that these things, whatever they were, possessed an insidious intelligence, herding her with malevolent precision. The sickening thought that she was being driven straight into a trap made her pivot. Abandoning the logging road, she plunged down a steep embankment, pine needles skittering underfoot, toward the familiar rush of Pine Creek. This terrain was etched in her childhood memories. She knew the creek would eventually lead her past the first houses on the town's edge. Safety, electricity, human voices. The creatures hesitated, their phantom cries receding as she veered off course, but Lena didn't break stride, didn't look back. The creek, swollen by recent rains, bit at her with shocking cold as she splashed through, soaking her shoes and the bottom of her running tights. Yet, the familiar gurgle of water was a balm, a real sound replacing the forest's unnatural, echoing mockery. She followed the creek bed, scrambling over slick rocks, her labored breathing echoing the splash of her feet, until, mercifully, the spectral barks faded entirely. After what felt like an eternity, perhaps 20 minutes of desperate flight, she saw it. The warm yellow glow of the Andersons' back porch light. A beacon. She clambered out of the creek, stumbled across their yard, her legs finally collapsing as adrenaline drained away, leaving her hollow and shivering. Mrs. Anderson found her there, hypothermic, babbling about dogs that weren't dogs, about voices in the forest, mimicking beloved pets. The next morning, the search party easily found Lena's original trail. But when they followed her route through the forest to the clearing where she claimed her encounter began, there was nothing. No tracks, no broken twigs, no sign that anything larger than a squirrel had passed through in weeks. 2 days later, Buster, the real Buster, was found frozen solid in a ravine 3 miles from where Lena had heard the whimpering. his throat torn out by claw marks too immense for any native Kentucky animal, the veterinarian confirmed. Lena never ran alone in the woods again. Her grandmother's warnings, once dismissed as ancient superstition, now echoed with chilling truth. She still runs, but only on well-lit tracks, under the electric glare of streetlights, where the roar of traffic drowns out any insidious whispers that might call from the darkness beyond. Chua. Tyler Garrett, the anchor of his friends, the steadfast designated driver, the calm voice of reason, found himself in a West Virginia hollow. When Jake Morrison and Cameron Wells, his college buddies, shunned Florida's sun-drenched beaches for a remote spring break camping trip, Tyler had reluctantly agreed to organize it. He meticulously researched campsites, tallied supplies, and mapped routes through the Monongahela National Forest, rationalizing it as a budget-friendly escape from the usual drunken college crowds. They'd grown up together in suburban Ohio, their bond forged over video games and shared classrooms since middle school. Now juniors at Ohio State, this trip was their chance to reconnect. Jake, a forestry major, boasted vast wilderness experience, though Tyler suspected much of it came from YouTube and gear catalogs. Cameron, a pre-med student, nursed a fervent fascination for local folklore, devouring obscure blogs about cryptids and urban legends. Tyler, an engineering major, approached life with methodical logic, which made him question the wisdom of their journey. With every mile his jeep burrowed deeper into the mountains. Their reserved campsite lay a full 15 miles from the nearest town, accessible only by a single-lane gravel track that snaked through a dense tapestry of oak, maple, and pine. The ranger station, when they arrived, was abandoned, save for a handwritten sign directing them to self-register and deposit fees into a corroded metal box that looked like it hadn't been emptied in months. The road to their site was a ribbon of precarious asphalt, barely wide enough for the jeep, with sheer drop-offs on one side and walls of rock and tangled vegetation on the other. Tyler gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, as the jeep's suspension groaned over deep ruts and scattered stones. They pulled into the campsite just as the sun bled across the western ridge, painting long skeletal shadows across the small clearing that would be their home for the next 4 days. It was more primitive than Tyler had anticipated. No water spigot, no fire ring, no picnic table, just a patch of relatively level earth encircled by towering trees that seemed to lean inward, scrutinizing the interlopers. Jake, oblivious, immediately began erecting his expensive 4-season tent. Cameron, phone in hand, wandered the perimeter, murmuring about the place having the right kind of energy for paranormal activity. Tyler, ever the pragmatist, focused on securing their food away from their sleeping quarters and gathering firewood before the last vestiges of twilight vanished. The first night passed without incident, though Tyler found himself stirring frequently, unsettled by the primal orchestra of the forest. Owls hooted, unseen creatures rustled in the undergrowth, and distant branches cracked. But woven into these familiar sounds were others, disembodied, patternless, like phantom footsteps circling their camp. He'd unzip his tent flap, shining his flashlight into the inky blackness, only to find shifting shadows in the moonlight. Jake and Cameron snored softly in their own tents, seemingly undisturbed, leaving Tyler to wonder if his own imagination was conjuring phantoms. The second day dawned with clear skies and a warmth that melted away the previous night's unease. They hiked an old logging trail bordering a creek, stopping to admire rock formations and the nascent wildflowers carpeting the forest floor. Cameron regaled them with local lore, tales of missing hikers and strange encounters dating back to the earliest European settlements. Jake, ever the skeptic, dismissed most of it as internet fabrication, but even his dismissive comments tapered off as they ventured deeper into the forest's darker, quieter heart, where the canopy swallowed the sunlight whole. As evening approached, The familiar unease began to creep back into Tyler's bones. The shadows seemed to lengthen prematurely, the ordinary sounds of the forest taking on an ominous quality that made him constantly glance over his shoulder. Jake built up the fire. Cameron stirred canned chili and instant rice for dinner, but Tyler found himself unable to focus. A gnawing sensation persisted. They were being watched. Something malevolent observed them from the tree line. The voice began just after darkness fell. They were gathered around the fire, sharing a bottle of whiskey Jake had smuggled in his backpack. At first, it sounded like one of them, calling from the edge of the clearing, just beyond the fire's flickering embrace. Tyler distinctly heard his own name, spoken in Cameron's voice. But when he looked across the flames, Cameron was right there, poking at the coals, humming softly. When Tyler asked, Cameron looked up, confused, shaking his head. Minutes later, Jake's name was called from the same direction, this time in Tyler's voice. Jake heard it too, sitting bolt upright, his gaze fixed on the tree line. The voice called again, closer now, still echoing Tyler's vocal patterns, but with a subtle, chilling wrongness in the inflection that made Tyler's skin prickle. It was like a warped recording of himself, familiar, yet fundamentally, viscerally distorted. Jake snatched a flashlight, sweeping its beam through the trees, but the light met only bare trunks and tangled undergrowth. Then came Cameron's name, in Jake's voice, from what seemed to be multiple directions at once. The sound circled their campsite, an unseen presence just beyond the firelight's fragile protection. Cameron's breath caught, a pale mask under the fire's nervous flicker. The robust enthusiasm he'd held for paranormal tales had leached away, leaving only dread as the truly unexplainable unfurled itself around them. The disembodied calls continued for nearly an hour, twisting their own voices, each repetition colder, less human than the last. When Jake, ever the pragmatist, declared he'd investigate, both Cameron and Tyler recoiled, protests dying in their throats. But Jake was a stubborn current, insisting it was a prank, a juvenile jape needing direct confrontation. He snatched his heavy-duty flashlight and a hunting knife, tools of a different, more tangible hunt, and plunged into the tree line, ignoring their pleas. Moonlight swallowed his beam almost instantly. Minutes later, his shouted challenges echoed back, sharp against the ridges, then slowly faded as he pushed deeper, until only the fire's crackle remained. Then, abruptly, the shouting ceased. They waited. Called his name. Only the whispers of the forest replied. 20 minutes bled into growing panic when Jake's voice returned, not from the direction he'd vanished, but from the exact spot the original uncanny calls had begun. "Help me," it pleaded, claiming to be lost, unable to find the camp. Yet every syllable was unnervingly precise, a cadence fundamentally wrong, as if read from a script, each word painstakingly articulated. Tyler moved to follow, but Cameron's grip clamped onto his arm, a desperate whisper. "Don't leave the fire." Cameron fumbled for his phone, the dead screen a cruel mockery of connection in the deep mountain wilderness. The false Jake continued its entreaties, darting from one direction to another, occasionally joined by distorted echoes of Tyler and Cameron, urging Jake back to camp. These voices began to converse, a chilling charade of searching, planning to split up and scour the forest. As night stretched, the imitation Jake's voice grew more grotesque, its artificiality less masked. What it described became increasingly bizarre. Impossible creatures, landscapes alien to their reality. Sometimes it would dissolve into prolonged, unnerving laughter or mutter streams of inverted English, syllables that almost held meaning, yet remained utterly nonsensical. Just before dawn, a rustle in the undergrowth sliced through the pre-morning quiet. A figure emerged from the trees. In the dim pre-dawn light, It was unmistakably Jake, returning. Yet something in its gait, a disjointed lurch, made Tyler instinctively reach for the bear spray in his tent. When it called out, the words were in Jake's familiar, casual tone, but the voice itself was a stranger's. Tyler jolted Cameron awake, pointing. Terror had fully awakened them both. The thing that wore Jake's shape emerged from the tree line, swaying at the edge of their camp, a mannequin struggling for balance. Dawn's nascent light revealed unsettling proportions. Jake's size and build, yes, but subtly, profoundly wrong. An arm seemed too long, the head canted at an impossible angle. When it smiled, it was a grotesque, stretched parody of Jake's usual grin. It spoke with Jake's voice, asking why they looked so scared, suggesting they pack up, go home. But Tyler noticed a horrific discord. Its mouth movements didn't quite align with the words, as if the voice was a separate entity, merely approximating speech. "What happened to Jake?" Tyler demanded. The creature paused an eternity, then launched into a rambling tale of getting lost in a cave, details shifting with each retelling. Tyler and Cameron began to retreat, slowly, eyes locked on the mimicry of their friend, moving towards Tyler's jeep. The thing followed, its lurching gait unwavering, spewing increasingly nonsensical pronouncements about their camping trip, their friendship. At the vehicle, Tyler fumbled for the keys, Cameron's gaze a shield, both bracing for the inevitable attack. But the creature simply stood, watching. As they scrambled into the jeep and the engine roared to life, it waved. That ghastly rictus smile remained as they sped away. Tyler caught its last image in the rearview mirror, motionless in the abandoned campsite, arm still raised in a static farewell, like a forgotten doll. They reported Jake missing, joined the fruitless search. No trace was ever found. Tyler and Cameron never spoke publicly of what they'd witnessed, knowing the futility of explaining a monster that wore a friend's face. The official report listed Jake as missing, presumed lost to the unforgiving wilderness. Tyler still dreams of that trip. Sometimes Jake calls to him from the tree line, accusing him of abandonment. But in the dream's stark clarity, Tyler knows it's not Jake, only an echo, a mimic perfected enough to fool the unwary. In those dark moments before waking, a chilling question gnaws at him. Did the real Jake die swiftly, or is some fragmented part of him still trapped in that hollow, forced to watch helplessly as his face and voice lure others into the encroaching darkness? Eli Morrison had always been the elder, the protector. He walked Noah to school, sat with him through homework, a silent guardian for his boisterous younger brother. At 11 and 8, their bond was forged in the quiet isolation of Copper Creek Road, eastern Tennessee, a converted farmhouse where their father maintained county roads and their mother cleaned houses 3 days a week. The nearest neighbor was a mile down the mountain, their only constant companions each other during the endless summer days. Noah vanished on a Tuesday in late June, the mountains ablaze with the white and pink confetti of blooming laurel, the creek behind their home running clear and cold from recent rains. That morning, the boys had been warriors, staking claim to their elaborate branch forts, defending their Cherokee territory from unseen invaders. Their mother's call for lunch had drawn Eli in, but Noah had begged for a few more minutes to finish the fort's roof. Eli, expecting his brother to follow within minutes, ate his sandwich. When Noah failed to appear after 20 minutes, Eli went looking, first to their usual haunts. He found the half-finished fort, branches scattered, as if Noah had simply lost interest and wandered. He called his brother's name, heard only his own voice thrown back by the impassive ridges. A systematic search of their familiar woods yielded nothing. No sign of Noah, no broken twig, no scuff mark indicating a direction. Eli returned to the house, a knot tightening in his stomach, praying Noah was inside, complaining about hunger. The search that followed consumed their small community. The county sheriff, volunteer firefighters, dozens of neighbors who knew the Morrison family scoured every hollow, every ridge within a 5-mile radius. They followed creek beds, old logging roads, their voices raw from calling Noah's name. Bloodhounds, brought in from Knoxville, lost the scent at the creek, unable to pick it up on the far bank. Helicopters droned overhead for 3 days, their rotors a constant, thrumming lament against the mountains, searching for any sign of the small boy who had simply ceased to be. Eli, only 11, joined the search. A desperate need to do something, anything, rather than wait impotently, propelled him through the familiar woods. He knew these trails, these animal paths, better than most adults, every root and rock a memory. The hollow ache of absence filled every corner of their small mountain home. Elias, just a boy of 12, led search teams through a labyrinth of childhood memories, the cave mouths he and his younger brother, Noah, had unearthed, the sun-drenched rocky overhangs where they'd devoured packed lunches, their laughter echoing through the pines. But each quest yielded nothing, not a scrap of fabric, not a faint footprint. It was as if the forest had simply swallowed 8-year-old Noah whole. After a grueling week, the official search dissolved into sporadic patrols, punctuated by false sightings that only twisted the knife of their despair. Grief counselors and social workers moved through their home like hushed specters, speaking in soft, meaningless platitudes of acceptance and healing. How could they heal when Noah's bed remained perpetually unmade, his toy soldiers still scattered across the shared bedroom floor? Elias's parents were adrift, caught in a brutal current between the impossible hope of Noah's return and the terrifying certainty that he was gone forever. Then, 3 weeks to the day since Noah vanished into the green, as dusk bled across the sky, Elias heard it. He was perched on the splintering porch swing beside his mother, both of them staring with haunted eyes at the dark, looming tree line that had claimed his brother. From the ridge above their home, a familiar voice drifted down, high and clear, calling his name. It was Noah, brimming with the same breathless excitement he always had when he'd stumbled upon a treasure in the woods, a smooth, cool stone, a feather hued like a jewel. His mother, lost in her own silent storm of tears, didn't stir. Elias wondered if his grief was finally fracturing his mind, but the voice returned. Every evening, always as the western mountains devoured the sun, casting long, hungry shadows across their yard. Noah would call from different points along the tree line, sometimes near their old fort, sometimes from the direction of the creek, even from higher on the ridge, a place they'd been strictly forbidden to explore alone. The urgency in his spectral calls was palpable, as if he'd unearthed something magnificent and needed Elias now. Yet there was never a glimpse of the boy himself, only the disembodied voice. Elias began to answer, his own voice steady, conversational. "Noah, where are you? Why don't you come home?" Sometimes a reply floated back, but the words were always skewed, as if Noah struggled to reshape thought into language. "Found the place where the singing comes from," he'd murmur. Or, cryptically, "The Gray people want to show you something." Then, the mountain opened up. There are rooms inside with no doors. The cadences were Noah's, the rhythms perfectly mimicked, but the content held an alien chill, unlike anything his 8-year-old brother would have ever conceived. Weeks bled into a month, and Noah's voice began to warp, subtly at first, then with an increasing, bone-deep dread. The excitement remained, a thin, glittering veneer, but beneath it, a hollow resonance seeped in, like echoes in a tomb. Sometimes Noah would repeat phrases, verbatim, as if his memory was a tattered cloth. Other times, phrases would simply trail off, swallowed by impossible silences in the middle of sentences. Most terrifying were the moments when the voice would drop to a sudden, guttural whisper, or simply cease midway through a thought, leaving Elias stranded in the suffocating quiet. Elias never spoke of the voices to his parents. He saw the fragile precipice on which they balanced, sensing that this new, grotesque burden would surely shatter them. Instead, he spent his evenings on the porch, a lone sentinel, responding to the unseen calls while his mother and father huddled inside, the television's blare a desperate barricade against their own crushing thoughts. He'd conduct one-sided dialogues with the voice, plying it with questions about Noah's whereabouts, what had happened to him. But the answers were always nonsensical, often contradicting previous, equally bizarre claims. The night everything changed began like all the others. Noah's voice, a thin thread against the darkening forest. Only this time, the characteristic excitement was gone, replaced by a raw, primal fear, a panic Elias had never heard from his little brother, not even in their most genuine moments of childhood fright. "Help me, Eli," Noah gasped, his voice straining. "Something's coming. You need to hide. Get inside the house and don't come out, no matter what you hear." The sheer terror in his tone was electrifying, unlike anything from the preceding weeks. And for the first time, Elias found himself compelled to obey. He bolted inside, slamming the front door, the deadbolt clicking like a shotgun. Then he found himself drawn to his bedroom window, peering through the gloom at the tree line. Movement flickered among the deep shadows, a pale, indistinct figure pacing back and forth along the forest's edge. It was the right size for Noah, but even from this distance, something was profoundly wrong with its gait. Too stiff, too mechanical, like a puppet jerked by untrained hands. As Elias watched, the figure froze, then turned, its indistinct head swiveling directly towards their house. Despite the distance, Elias knew, with an icy certainty, that it was staring straight at his bedroom window. The thing that wore Noah's silhouette raised one arm, waving. A slow, deliberate arc that stretched into an eternity. Then, its jaw opened, and Noah's name began to echo through the night. But this time, the calls erupted from everywhere at once, as if dozens of Noahs were scattered through the forest, their voices rising in an unsettling, perfect unison. The calls continued through the long, agonizing night. Sometimes from the tree line, sometimes closer to the house, even, impossibly, from the roof itself. Elias huddled in his bed, pressing his pillow against his ears, desperate to block out the relentless, pleading chorus of his brother's voice, begging him to come outside. But even through the fabric, he heard Noah's words, words that crawled under his skin, describing the wondrous things beneath the mountain, the kind people who had cared for him, and how desperately he wanted Elias to join him, so they could be brothers forever. When morning finally broke, the voices ceased, silenced by the encroaching light. Elias crept to the window. The pale figure was gone. But scattered across their dew-kissed yard were objects, toys, personal belongings. They might have been Noah's, if not for the subtle, unsettling wrongness of each item. A baseball glove, the right color, but too large. A toy truck that mimicked Noah's favorite, but sported too many wheels. Clothing that resembled his brother's outfits, yet with details unnervingly altered. They were arranged with an almost desperate precision, as if a memory, imperfect and fading, had been forced to manifest. Elias never heard Noah's voice again after that night. He continued his vigil on the porch every evening, waiting, listening, until his family finally fled Copper Creek Road. They relocated to a house in town, where streetlights banished the encroaching shadows, and the ceaseless hum of traffic drowned out any lingering whispers from the darkness. Elias carried the weight of his brother's disappearance into adulthood, a phantom limb that throbbed with unanswerable questions. He wondered endlessly if he could have done something differently. He listened, always, for a familiar voice that never returned. Sometimes, years later, he would dream of Noah. His brother, finally home, waiting in their old bedroom, wearing that same excited grin, ready to share a new discovery. But in these dreams, when Elias looked closer at Noah's face, the features would be subtly off, the proportions distorted, as if someone had meticulously recreated his brother from faded photographs and fractured memories. And when this dream Noah spoke, his voice held that same hollow echo Elias remembered from those terrible weeks, as if spoken by a thing that had learned to imitate human speech, but had never quite grasped the fragile nuances of emotion. Elias never returned to Copper Creek Road, but he often wondered what searchers might discover if they were brave enough to peer into the deep places beneath the mountain, into the hidden caves and shadowed valleys where the boundary between the living world and the things that should not be grew impossibly thin. He wondered if they would find traces of his brother, or if they would find something else entirely, something that had learned to wear Noah's face and speak with Noah's voice, but carried not a single echo of the boy who had vanished that summer morning when the mountain laurel bloomed and the world still seemed safe and predictable. Hazel Garrett had always been a girl drawn to the edge. The instigator amongst her friends, she'd suggest reckless midnight excursions and dare them to follow, proposing plans that seemed exhilarating at 14, but horrifying in hindsight. Raised amidst the ancient mountains of southwestern Virginia, she knew every forgotten back road, every clandestine trail within a 10-mile radius of her family's farm. She prided herself on a fearlessness that carried her into places other teenagers wouldn't even glimpse. It was this potent blend of local lore and audacious courage that first spurred her to suggest the midnight expedition to Devil's Bridge, a crumbling stone arch spanning a dizzying gorge 3 miles up the winding Rattlesnake Creek. The Civil-era bridge, a skeletal testament to Confederate ingenuity, now stood abandoned, a section of its roadway swallowed by a winter storm decades past. Local whispers clung to it like the mountain mist, a curse born from the phantom of a Union soldier, pushed to his death from its heights by rebel sympathizers, his intelligence for federal forces forever lost. More chilling still were the recent tales teenagers, lured by dares, vanishing without a trace, their disappearances dismissed by Sheriff Brody as runaways or accidents in the gorge's treacherous embrace. Hazel Dubois knew these stories well. Her older brother Wade, a font of local lore, had claimed to cross it once, dismissing the ghost as nonsense, but warning of the bridge's true peril. Yawning gaps in the stone, a 30-foot plummet to the rocky creek below. That warning, far from deterring her, ignited a spark. It was the perfect, terrifying capstone for a sleepover with her closest friends, Morgan Ellis, Cassidy Webb, and Nora Stevens. Inseparable since grade school, they were an island in their small mountain town, too clever for the popular clique, too rebellious for the straight-laced, too fiercely independent to care for any mold. Weekends were spent as urban explorers of abandoned shells, swimmers in secret creek pools, trading ghost stories they pretended to scoff at but secretly yearned to believe. The thought of a genuine brush with the supernatural thrilled and terrified them in equal measure. The midnight bridge crossing, they agreed, was their best chance. Their expedition was set for the new moon in late October, when the darkness would be absolute, a shroud against prying adult eyes. Hazel, with a practiced nonchalance, convinced her parents of a night filled with movies and junk food, the classic sleepover tableau. Beneath this facade, she meticulously packed flashlights, a coil of rope, a first aid kit, even her father's heavy camping gear. It was responsibility, she told herself, even as she charted the most reckless adventure of her young life. Her friends, a mix of thrill and apprehension, spent the week voraciously researching the history of Devil's Bridge, their theories growing more elaborate, more unsettling. The night itself conspired with their plan. Cold, overcast, a thick fog snaking through the valleys, obscuring the ridges above. Once Hazel's parents' snores softened into a steady rhythm, they slipped out the basement door, melting into the night. Their 3-mile trek up Rattlesnake Creek began, a winding path through dense oak and pine that swallowed the meager starlight. The trail was a serpentine beast in the dark, roots grasping, rocks shifting. They took turns with the flashlight, hushed warnings punctuating the forest's profound silence. As they climbed, the fog thickened, the temperature dropped, their hurried breaths pluming in the frigid air. A tremor of doubt, cold and sharp, touched Hazel. Had they bitten off too much? The trail fragmented, disappearing into overgrown tangles of mountain laurel and rhododendron. More than once they backtracked, guided only by Hazel's fragmented memories of daytime hikes. When they finally emerged from the choking fog, Devil's Bridge materialized. It loomed, a monstrous arch against the charcoal sky, its ancient masonry a canvas of black, streaked with mineral deposits. The roadway was a shattered mosaic, gaping holes hinting at the abyss below. The entire structure seemed to flex with the invisible mountain wind, a low groan echoing through the narrow canyon. Far beneath them, the unseen Rattlesnake Creek roared, its symphony of rushing water bouncing off the stone, a disembodied chorus. Morgan was the first to voice the tremor of fear. "It looks worse than I thought." The gaps were wider, the stones beneath their feet unstable, ready to betray any foolish step. Cassidy, her voice a reedy whisper, agreed. "Maybe we just take some pictures and go home?" But Hazel, weeks of anticipation coursing through her veins, was not ready to retreat. To leave without crossing felt like a surrender. She was steeling herself for argument when it began. A humming. Low, primal, emanating from the bridge itself, a melodic drone that vibrated through the ancient stone, resonated deep in their bones. At first, they dismissed it as the wind, a trick of acoustics. But as they strained to listen, its human quality sharpened. A lullaby, imbued with centuries of sorrow and longing. The melody, hauntingly beautiful, sent a prickle of dread through their skin, echoing in the vast, echoing gorge. Nora, unnerved, urged immediate departure. Before anyone could respond, movement. A figure, draped in shadow, materialized on the bridge, silhouetted against the slightly lighter sky. It was a woman, in what appeared to be a long dress or robe, moving with a deliberate, unnervingly familiar grace, as if every loose stone, every yawning gap, was mapped in her memory. She paid them no mind, continuing her mournful hum, pacing the span from end to end, then turning, retracing her steps. Hazel's mouth went dry. The figure paced, an endless pendulum against the fog, never stopping, never acknowledging their breath-held presence. Just walking and humming. There was a fundamental wrongness in her gait, a stiffness suggesting she was not entirely human or entirely alive. Her dress seemed to billow even in the still air. Shadows played tricks, hinting at a face, pale and gaunt, with hollow dark chasms where eyes should have been. Every instinct screamed at Hazel to run, but a strange compulsion seized her. "Are you lost?" she called out, her voice fragile against the vastness. The humming ceased. The woman turned. Her movements were too quick, too fluid. When she opened her mouth, her voice carried the same melodic, unsettling quality as her hum, but the words were a jumble. An archaic dialect, or perhaps no human language at all. Then she began to walk towards them, stepping off the bridge, moving with inhuman grace down the trail, arms extended as if to embrace them. They ran. No discussion, no planning, just pure, animalistic terror. They crashed through the undergrowth, the forest tearing at their clothes, their skin. Behind them, the woman's melodic voice pursued them, her words growing more urgent, more desperate. Sometimes it seemed to come from directly behind, close enough they expected to feel her touch. But when they risked a glance, there was only the shifting fog, the dancing shadows between the trees. Panic splintered them. Each girl fled her own desperate path through the inky black. Hazel found herself alone, her flashlight flickering, her ragged gasps burning in the cold air. The woman's voice was everywhere now, from multiple directions, dozens of them, it seemed, their mournful songs searching for the teenagers who had dared to disturb their midnight vigil. Finally, Hazel stumbled onto a logging road, a familiar landmark in the chaos. She followed it downhill, her lungs screaming, until the reassuring glimmer of her family's farmhouse lights pierced the fog. Morgan and Cassidy were already there, huddled on the porch, arriving mere moments before her. But Nora was gone. They waited until dawn, their calls swallowed by the vast, indifferent mountain, before a desperate call to Sheriff Brody. The search for Nora lasted 3 agonizing days. Dozens of volunteers scoured every trail, every hollow within 5 miles of Devil's Bridge, tracking creek beds, peering into every cave and overhang where a lost teenager might seek shelter. They found nothing. No footprints, no torn fabric, no trace that Nora Stevens had ever been there at all. The official report had buried Nora under a polite shroud of words. Missing, presumed dead, likely a victim of a fall or exposure in treacherous mountain terrain. Hazel knew better. She never spoke of the bridge, of the singing woman, of the endless, spectral pacing. Who would believe a story whispered from the edge of sanity? Yet in the quiet chambers of her mind, a gnawing question persisted. Had Nora, her dearest friend, been lured by that hypnotic voice, snatched from the trail into whatever unholy realm the singer claimed beyond Devil's Bridge? Sometimes when the fog clung to the peaks, and the wind howled like a banshee through the mountains, a mournful humming would drift down from Rattlesnake Creek. Hazel would pull her blankets tighter, burying her face, fighting the vivid memory of a pale figure, arms outstretched in an eerie welcome, moving through the moonless night. Years later, cloaked in the anonymity of city lights and a new life far from those haunted hills, the dream still came. Devil's Bridge. Nora, beside the creature, both humming, an ancient, sorrowful duet. And when they turned, their gazes were one. Nora's eyes, echoed in the creature's, were dark, hollowed wells of agony. Her voice, once so alive, now held the same melodic cadence of suffering, of centuries of patient waiting. 3 years Mason Webb had diligently stamped his days to the rhythm of Blackhawk mining. Then came the transfer, a remote processing facility, tucked deep in the hills of Wise County, Virginia. Here, coal was washed, sorted, and devoured by trains day and night, destined for hungry power plants across the southeast. Mason drew the night shift, a skeletal crew of 2, himself and Roy Caldwell, a grizzled old miner whose face was etched with the lore of these mountains. Roy knew every legend, whispered every ghost story, filling the long, quiet hours between equipment checks. The facility sat cradled in a narrow valley, flanked by 2 towering ridges, its only tether to the world a 7-mile ribbon of road snaking through dense forest. From 11 at night until 7 in the morning, Mason's world was a symphony of distant machinery and the rumble of passing coal trains. It suited him, this isolation. It gave him space for books, for correspondence courses, a sanctuary between hourly rounds of the silent, hulking buildings. and equipment yards. Roy had been there since the beginning, 15 years, claiming to know every creak of the facility, every shift of shadow, every creature that slinked through the surrounding hills. But more unsettling were Roy's stories of the valley before Black Hawk arrived. A mining disaster in the 1920s, he'd recount, 17 men entombed by a methane explosion in a shaft on the western ridge. Bodies never recovered, the mine sealed away with concrete, forgotten. Yet, Roy swore, on the quietest nights, he could hear voices echoing from its direction. Mason initially dismissed it all as Appalachian folklore, the kind of harmless superstition that gilded the edges of any industrial outpost. But in his 4th month, Roy simply vanished. No call, no sick leave, just gone. Mason's calls to Roy's trailer went unanswered, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. Roy, a lonely man 10 miles up the mountain, with no family to check on him. After his shift, Mason drove. He found the trailer door ajar, Roy's truck in the driveway, and his work clothes laid out, a still life of interrupted routine. No struggle, no sign of violence, just an emptiness where a man should be. Mason called the sheriff, then waited, a silent sentinel beside the deputy as they scoured the small trailer and its immediate surroundings. The deputy took his statement, promised to follow up, but Mason saw the truth in his eyes. Here, in this unforgiving wilderness, hope was a scarce commodity. For the next week, the facility was Mason's alone. The solitude he found was heavier than he'd anticipated, pregnant with the unsettling knowledge of Roy's disappearance. Every creak, every rustle, sent a jolt through him. Shadows became phantoms, equipment piles, lurking figures. His radio, clutched in his hand, was a lifeline he constantly checked for its reassuring squelch. Without Roy's rambling stories, his encyclopedic knowledge of their shared history, the silence itself seemed to expand, stretching into the void where human conversation once dwelled. It felt as if something else had moved in. Then, in his 2nd week of solitary nights, the radio calls began. Always in the deepest hours, between 2 and 4 a.m., when the facility hummed its lowest and the forest pressed in, an inky tide against the chain-link fences. The voice was unmistakably Roy's, his drawl, his habit of calling Mason young man, despite Mason's 32 years. But the words themselves, they were wrong. They made Mason's skin prickle, as if a ghost were attempting to mimic the cadence of the living, a poor imitation of security guard banter. The first call came on a Tuesday. Mason was in the coal loading area, making his 2 a.m. rounds. Roy's voice, a static-laced phantom, asked about the perimeter fences, warned against copper thieves. Normal at first. Then Roy started describing impossible things, equipment conditions nowhere near the main gate, buildings that didn't exist. When Mason asked for his exact location, the radio went dead. The rest of the shift was a frantic, fruitless search. The calls increased. Routine security concerns, always in Roy's voice, always laced with increasingly surreal details. Intruders in impossible hiding spots, phantom equipment malfunctions, procedures Black Hawk had never implemented. Most chillingly, Roy would claim to see Mason himself in places Mason knew he couldn't be. As if the voice on the radio existed in a parallel facility, a spectral twin. Mason suspected a cruel prank, perhaps recorded snippets of Roy's voice. He reported it to his supervisor, who promised an IT investigation. Nothing. No unauthorized transmissions, just the dismissal. Crosstalk from other facilities. But the voice continued to reference facility-specific details no outsider could know. The night everything changed began like any other. Routine patrols, hourly check-ins. Then, around midnight, Roy's voice crackled through, a chillingly urgent plea. meet him at the old mine entrance on the western ridge. He'd found something important, something Mason needed to see. The request was a violation of policy, flagrantly wrong. Mason almost ignored it. But the urgency in that voice, it clawed at something primal. Was Roy trapped? Was this a genuine cry for help? Against his better judgment, Mason drove to the western edge of the facility, parking near the chain-link fence. The old mine, Roy had described, was a quarter-mile up the ridge, sealed by a crumbling concrete plug. Flashlight in hand, radio clutched tightly, Mason slipped through a gap in the fence. A quick look, he told himself. If he found nothing, he'd return. The ridge, a treacherous ascent of loose shale and tangled undergrowth, loomed impossibly steeper in the darkness. The beam of Mason's flashlight cut a trembling swathe through the skeletal trees and jagged boulders, each step a battle against the unforgiving terrain of Wise County. His breath hitched in ragged spasms, the cold mountain air clawing at his throat. For 20 grueling minutes, the only sounds were his own gasps and the crunch of shale underfoot, until a looming shadow resolved into the gaping maw of an old mine entrance. It was a concrete plug, crudely set into the hillside, dominated by a rusted iron door. Despite its supposed permanent seal, it hung ajar, a sliver of darkness beckoning. Fresh scratch marks, raw against the old metal, spoke of recent violence, of something pried open. A gust of cool, damp air ghosted out, carrying the stench of wet earth and decay, the mine's ancient breath. Mason's voice, a hollow echo in the vastness, called out Roy's name. The stillness only answered with its own distant, mocking return. He was turning, preparing to abandon this ghost-ridden place, when Roy's voice again crackled through his radio, closer now, impossibly close. "Mason, just inside the entrance. Need a hand with something." The static and distortion that had plagued previous transmissions were gone, replaced by an unnerving clarity. But it wasn't Roy. The cadence was wrong, each word parsed and articulated with a pedantic exactness that felt alien. Long, stretching pauses punctuated sentences, as if the speaker was consulting an invisible script, searching for the next line. Mason took an involuntary step back from the yawning darkness. His heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs, a realization, cold and stark, that whatever spoke through the radio was not Roy, and perhaps never had been. Behind him, from the inky blackness of the shaft, came a sound. A wet, dragging scrape, growing louder, closer, too heavy, too fluid to be human. Roy's voice, now tinged with a feigned urgency, pulsed from the radio, demanding to know why Mason was leaving, promising wonderful things if he would only come deeper, where they could talk properly. Mason stumbled down the ridge, gravity pulling him toward the fragile safety of the facility, the radio's voice a relentless pursuit. But then, other voices joined the chorus. Roy, from a deeper part of the forest. Roy, whispering just behind him on the path. Roy, inside his own head, a chilling intimacy. As he fled, the voice mutated, shedding its human skin. Echoes and dissonant harmonics warped the cadence, suggesting an anatomy utterly alien, a thing not built for speech, but for something far older, far more sinister. His hands shaking uncontrollably, Mason barely managed to steer his vehicle back to the security office. He spent the rest of his shift barricaded inside, every light blazing, the radio a venomous presence he refused to acknowledge. When the day shift supervisor, a portly man named Mr. Finch, arrived at 7 a.m., he found Mason rigid at his desk, eyes wide and fixed on the radio, whispering about something in the old mine that had learned to imitate Roy, trying to lure him into the tunnels. The company terminated Mason's employment that very day, citing protocol violations and dereliction of duty. The official incident report, meticulously omitted any mention of the radio calls or his claims, chalking it all up to stress and isolation-induced breakdown. Mason never worked security again. He left Wise County, leaving the brooding mountains and their burden of buried secrets behind. Years later, news of the Black Hawk facility's closure due to accidents and equipment failures no longer surprised him. He often wondered about the new night shift guards, if they too had heard Roy's voice, a patient, hungry lure from the darkness. And he wondered if Roy was still trapped within those lightless tunnels, while something else, a mimic with an ancient hunger, used his voice to call new victims to the depths where 17 miners had died nearly a century ago, their voices now part of the chorus calling from beneath the mountain. Nora Stevens had always cherished the annual family reunions. 3 generations of her sprawling kin converged on the remote valley where her great-grandfather Thomas had built his homestead in the 1920s. These mountains of eastern Kentucky were etched into the family's very bones, and the homestead, with its original hand-hewn log cabin and newer additions, was a sanctuary where cousins, scattered across states, rekindled their Appalachian roots. The reunion always unfurled under the full bloom of mountain laurel in the first week of August, the creek behind the property running clearest and coolest. Her parents, Jack and Linda Stevens, arrived days early, bustling about, opening up cabins and preparing the facilities. Aunts and uncles streamed in from Ohio, Tennessee, and West Virginia, their cars laden with children and grandchildren. By Friday evening, the valley pulsed with laughter and conversation. 25, sometimes 30, souls gathering for 3 days of shared meals, stories passed like heirlooms, and the unspoken communion of shared blood. Nora, at 16, had attended everyone since she was a toddler. But this year, a subtle shift unsettled her. Perhaps it was her age, the dawning comprehension of the darker family lore whispered by the adults after the younger ones were supposed to be asleep. Tales of relatives swallowed by the mountains, or of unexplained deaths. Or perhaps it was the quiet void left by Great-Uncle Raymond, the most vibrant storyteller, who had passed that winter, leaving an absence none dared to voice. The first tremor of unease struck on Friday afternoon. Uncle Marcus, usually among the first, never arrived with his family. He lived alone in Lexington now, his wife Margaret having passed 3 years prior, making his absence all the more troubling. He was the family's walking encyclopedia on the property, the organizer of the reunion's rhythm. His delay threw off their customary flow. Calls to his home and cell went unanswered. Saturday morning brought chilling news. Marcus's neighbors had found his car in the driveway, his front door ajar, but no trace of Marcus. The police designated it a missing persons case, yet offered no clues. The family, phones clutched tight, decided to proceed with the reunion, but the celebration felt hushed, amputated without his booming laugh and endless anecdotes. It was during the traditional Saturday evening cookout, as Nora helped Aunt Carol arrange food, that Marcus's voice first drifted from the tree line. It carried from the old logging road, deeper into the mountains, calling her father's name. It was unmistakably Marcus, his usual loud, jovial tone, asking Jack to help him carry something heavy from his car. Jack stopped, called back, asking where he'd been. But when he walked towards the tree line, he found only an empty forest, his own voice chasing after a fading echo. Other family members had heard it too. Flashlights pierced the deepening twilight as they searched, calling Marcus's name, receiving no reply. The voice had been so real, so entirely Marcus, that many insisted he must be nearby, perhaps injured or disoriented. They searched past midnight, fueled by a desperate hope, until exhaustion forced them back to their cabins and tents. Sunday unfolded with more of Marcus's voice, a spectral presence moving just out of sight, yet always clearly audible. Sometimes he pleaded for help, lost or trapped. Other times he spoke casually, as if standing right beside them. Systematic searches yielded nothing, no trace, no disturbed foliage, no footprints. As Sunday evening approached and families began to pack, the voices intensified, growing more frequent, more disquieting. The late afternoon sun bled into the old cabin, painting its dusty windows with a final, desperate gold. Inside, a voice, unmistakably Marcus's, called out to Nora. It asked her to come in, to help with something, the familiar patience and encouragement dripping from every word. It was the same tone her great-uncle had used for years, guiding her through the tangled roots of family history, the ancient rhythms of mountain tradition. But something in the timing, in the very grain of his words, felt wrong, a jarring discord in the symphony of memory. It was as if someone were rifling through Marcus's mind, plucking out recollections, but utterly misunderstanding their context, their delicate place in the tapestry of a life. Nora, a chill beginning to prickle her skin despite the fading warmth, approached the cabin. Through the grimy glass, a figure stood at the old kitchen table, its back to her, sorting through scattered papers and photographs. From behind it was Marcus, the familiar cut of his shirt, the slope of his shoulders. But the posture was unnerving, too rigid, too still, like a mannequin forgotten in a storefront display. And the way it moved, when it did, was all wrong, jerky, unnatural, as if its bones were loosely jointed. Most unsettling was the head, tilted at an angle that defied human comfort, a grotesque skew that suggested a broken neck, a spine unmoored. A silent scream caught in Nora's throat. She backed away, the gravel crunching under her feet like shattered glass. "Father!" she finally managed to cry out, her voice thin and reedy in the deepening twilight. By the time Jack arrived, with several other restless family members close behind, the figure had vanished. The cabin was empty, save for the dust motes dancing in the last sliver of light and the familiar scent of mice. The papers from the table, now strewn across the floorboards, included old family photographs. But these weren't faded heirlooms. They were fresh prints of relatives long dead, their faces stark and vibrant. One showed Uncle Marcus himself, standing in this very room, but taken from an impossible vantage point, as though the camera had floated near the ceiling. A collective shiver ran through the family. No one needed to speak the words aloud. The decision was made in the quick glances, the tightening jaws. They would leave. Now. In the encroaching darkness, they feverishly packed belongings while Marcus's voice, now tinged with a raw, inhuman desperation, called to them from every shadowed corner of the property. It pleaded, promised explanations, begged them to stay just one more night. Yet there was no true emotion in the plea, no genuine understanding of loyalty or love. It was a mimicry, a chilling echo of sentiment, learned but not felt. As the convoy of vehicles churned down the narrow mountain road, a faint figure appeared in their rearview mirrors. It stood in the middle of the road, arms outstretched, precisely where they had left the homestead. It was Marcus, dressed in the clothes he'd planned for the reunion, utterly motionless, a scarecrow silhouetted against the burgeoning stars. Even as the distance widened, the figure remained, frozen in a silent, desperate tableau. The last car rounded a bend, the homestead vanishing from sight, but the image lingered. Marcus, or what wore his skin, abandoned to the hungry night. The family never returned. The land, eventually sold to developers, remained cursed. Construction workers, driven away by disembodied voices and tools rearranged into unsettling, meaningless patterns, aborted their plans. The property defaulted to the state, now an abandoned expanse, accessible only by a winding logging road that vanished into the ever-thickening forest. Marcus's body was never found, officially listed as missing, presumed dead. But his family knew otherwise. They knew something in these mountains had consumed Marcus, possessed his voice, his image, to lure others into its grasp. And they knew the old family reunions, the cherished traditions, were over. Some histories, some mountains, developed an appetite for the stories and memories that wove generations together. Nora still woke sometimes from dreams of that final reunion. Dreams where Uncle Marcus stood in the cabin doorway, beckoning her closer with that familiar, patient smile. But in these nightmares, his eyes were wrung too wide, too dark, and his mouth, stretching into a smile that no human face could possibly hold, held a deeper horror. She knew, with the cold certainty only nightmares could bring, that the thing wearing Marcus's face wasn't just hungry for her presence. It craved her memories, her voice, her very connection to family, until nothing remained but another hollow imitation, waiting in the shadows, calling to the next generation with words of love that masked an insatiable hunger. Wade Patterson, 42, had traversed the spine of the Appalachian Trail for 15 years, accumulating thousands of miles on his boots, his spirit honed by every challenging ridge and whispering valley between Georgia and Maine. He prided himself on his wilderness acumen, a seasoned backcountry traveler capable of facing sudden blizzards, black bears, or aggressive wild boars with unblinking resolve. His pack held the latest GPS, emergency comms, and enough survival gear for extended solitude in sections of the trail virtually untouched since Cherokee hunters roamed these ridges centuries ago. That year, late autumn, Wade chose a particularly challenging stretch in southwestern Virginia, a relentless climb through dense forests that eventually broke out onto exposed ridges, offering breathtaking vistas. He'd hiked it before, but never when the tourist season had bled out, when most recreational hikers had retreated to their urban comforts. The trail maintenance crews were gone too, leaving fallen trees and encroaching vegetation to reclaim the path, making every step a deliberate challenge. His solo, 5-day trek began on a Thursday in early November. The trailhead parking lot was empty, save for his truck. The forecast promised clear skies and crisp, air-perfect conditions for the kind of demanding journey that allowed him to push his limits and drink deep from the well of true wilderness solitude. He planned 15 miles a day, camping at designated sites, resupplying from food caches he'd buried during earlier scouting trips. The first 2 days unfolded with the familiar, comforting rhythm of backcountry travel. He rose before dawn, broke camp with practiced efficiency, and covered his mileage with time to spare, setting up his evening bivouac and cooking dinner before the encroaching darkness. The autumn air was a crisp benediction, the hardwood trees still ablaze with brilliant foliage, morning frost sparkling like scattered diamonds in the nascent sunlight. He encountered no other hikers, precisely what he had sought in this off-season adventure. It was on the third day that Wade first felt it, the prickle of being watched. It began as an uncomfortable, almost primal awareness, the kind of deep-seated alertness that had kept his ancestors alive in hostile environments, yet felt utterly out of place in the modern wilderness. He'd felt it before, that cold dread before a bear or mountain lion revealed itself. But when he stopped, scanning the dense forest with his binoculars, he saw nothing. Nothing to explain the sudden, unsettling unease that coiled in his gut. The feeling persisted, growing stronger as he climbed higher, the trees growing thicker, the shadows deepening into velvet pools. That evening, as Wade set up his camp in a small clearing beside a gurgling mountain stream, he began to hear it. Footsteps. At first they were subtle, barely audible above the rush of water and the rustle of wind through the trees. But they possessed a distinct, unmissable human cadence, utterly different from animal movements. Someone, or something, was out there, circling the periphery of his vision, pacing back and forth in the gathering darkness, as if planning its next move. Wade called out several times, identifying himself as a hiker, asking if assistance was needed. No reply. Only the persistent, careful padding of footsteps in the undergrowth just beyond the reach of his headlamp. The canvas of his tent stretched taut against the restless night, each rustle outside a whisper that frayed Wade's nerves. Footsteps circled his campsite, a slow, deliberate cadence that echoed the beat of his own panicked heart until the first pale hint of dawn. Sometimes, low voices, too hushed to decipher, yet undeniably locked in some obscure discourse, a strange muffled quality to them, as if human speech was being replayed at the wrong speed or filtered through some distorting, unseen device. But the most chilling tremor came from a sudden, stark certainty. One of those voices, it tugged at a memory, a phantom familiarity he couldn't quite grasp. The fourth day broke with a deceptive clearness, the sun warming his skin even as a cold dread settled deep in his bones. The stalking had escalated. Whispers of movement now flickered at the edges of his vision. Figures pacing him through the ancient pines, vanishing into mist and shadow whenever he dared to turn directly. Human in shape, yes, but their gaits, a liquid, unnatural fluidity, as if sinew and bone bent to a different, grotesque anatomy. They anticipated every turn, emerging ahead on the winding trail, positioning themselves with an unnerving precision, as though privy to some secret map of his despair. At a scenic overlook, perched high above a yawning valley, Wade finally caught one of them unawares. 50 yards away, at the fringe of the timberline, stood a figure that seized his breath and turned his blood to ice. Danny Morrison. His old hiking partner, clad in the very same faded red jacket, the same scuffed trekking boots Wade remembered from their shared adventures 5 years past. But Danny had died. A climbing accident in Colorado, a funeral Wade had attended, a casket he had helped carry to the cold earth. Danny. The apparition stood perfectly still, an eerie tableau against the whispering trees, its gaze fixed on Wade with an unsettling, patient interest. As if waiting. Wade's throat tightened. "Danny," he croaked, raising a tentative hand, a desperate part of him clinging to the delusion that his friend had somehow cheated death, that an explanation, a miracle lay waiting. But the figure remained silent, unmoving, its eyes, Danny's eyes, unblinking. When Wade took a shuffling step forward, the thing moved. Not walking, but melting into the forest with a swift, impossible grace, leaving not a single displaced leaf, no imprint in the soft earth. Just an absence. The ghost of Danny returned, sometimes alone, sometimes accompanied by other indistinct shapes, always keeping a precise distance. They herded him, not towards safety, but subtly, inexorably, away from any familiar path, deeper into the bewildering heart of the woods where cell service died and rescue was a forgotten word. A chilling realization solidified. These were not mere curiosities. They possessed intelligence, a sinister purpose. As dusk began to bleed into the sky, painting the western horizon in bruised purples and oranges, Wade knew. He was lost. His GPS flickered, then died, its battery mysteriously drained. Trail markers, once a comforting guide, were either gone or had been deliberately turned, each misdirection a new knot in his mounting terror. The designated campsites, the familiar routes, all dissolved into an uncharted wilderness. His backup devices, too, were failing, succumbing to the same unseen sabotage. He pitched his tent in a small clearing, exposed and vulnerable, the surrounding forest a silent gallery of waiting eyes. As darkness swallowed the last vestiges of daylight, he saw them. Pale figures, indistinct yet undeniably human, moving among the trees. They kept their distance, but their movements were coordinated, a slow, predatory dance around his makeshift refuge. Wade gripped his hiking poles, improvising a shield against an enemy that refused to show aggression, content merely to observe, to wait. Midnight brought the return of Danny. It emerged from the forest, walking with the casual, familiar confidence that had defined his friend in life. It stopped just beyond the weak glow of Wade's lantern and spoke, in Danny's voice, about old trails, forgotten plans, shared memories. But it was wrong, horribly, fundamentally wrong. The conversation felt like a performance, a mimicry by something that had never been human, struggling to recall the cadence of friendship from fragments of memory, from overheard words. The Danny thing invited him on a night hike to a special place, a hidden waterfall, a forgotten cave system Danny had supposedly discovered. The voice, the gestures were flawless imitations, but the content, it was a twisted fiction, an impossibility that clawed at Wade's mind. He politely declined, mumbled about daylight, a desperate hope that morning might reveal the truth. The creature smiled, a slow, knowing acknowledgement, as if his refusal was part of its own grotesque script. Then it began to change. Slow enough for Wade to witness every horrific detail. Its features melted, softened like wax, dissolving Danny's face into something alien, unspeakable. Skin mottled to gray, eyes distended, deepening pools of black, and the mouth. The mouth stretched into a rictus grin, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth that no earthly predator possessed. The transformation complete, it let out a sound that began with Danny's familiar laugh, but spiraled into a chilling, blood-curdling shriek. Wade grabbed his pack, abandoning his campsite and most of his gear in a blind rush to escape. Behind him, the forest erupted in a cacophony of voices, all calling his name. Some were Danny's, others strange and alien, yet all imbued with that same artificiality, the unsettling echo of beings mimicking human speech without comprehension. They pursued him through the darkness, their calls always just ahead, no matter his direction. He stumbled onto an old logging road, following it downhill until it spilled onto a county highway where he flagged down a passing motorist. The Park Service was notified, his abandoned gear reported. He never went back. He never hiked alone again. The official report cited altitude sickness, dehydration, hallucinations. But Wade knew the truth. He'd encountered something in those mountain shadows that fed on grief, on memory, using the faces of the lost to lure the living to their own silent disappearances. Even now, the dreams haunt him. Danny at the edge of his camp, smiling that same patient, inviting smile, beckoning him toward one more adventure. But in the dreams, Wade sees them now. The other figures, dozens of them, emerging from the deep shadows behind Danny. Their faces are the faces of the long lost, the forever vanished, all smiling with the same chilling warmth, an invitation that conceals an appetite for something far more precious than flesh and blood. Cassidy Wheeler, a long-haul trucker for 3 grueling years, navigated the Blue Ridge Parkway with the practiced ease of long acquaintance. Her route from Atlanta to Baltimore carried her through some of the most breathtaking yet isolated stretches of the Appalachian Mountains. She preferred the quiet pilgrimage of night, when the winding roads were hers alone, unburdened by the slow meander of tourist vehicles. At 28, with over 200,000 miles etched into her career, the Blue Ridge remained her favored passage, especially in autumn when the fiery canopies of red and gold transformed even the most arduous run into a scenic journey. The stretch of highway that would forever etch itself into her nightmares lay in southwestern Virginia, a nexus where the Blue Ridge Parkway intersected with county roads that snaked into remote communities, swallowed by the vastness of the George Washington and Jefferson National Forests. This was deep country, miles of wilderness without cell service, where the nearest gas station might be a 30-mile anachronism. Cassidy knew every curve, every dip, every treacherous grade, having driven it in all weathers, at all hours. But nothing, not a single mile in her vast experience, had prepared her for what began on a foggy October night, running behind schedule, pushing hard to make her delivery. The trouble started simply enough. A stranded motorist, huddled on the shoulder of the parkway, about 15 miles south of Westboro. Cassidy's personal code compelled her to stop. Always. The insistent flicker of emergency lights painted the fog-shrouded asphalt red. Cassidy, a veteran of routes that twisted through the vertebrae of the Blue Ridge, knew those mountain roads were unforgiving. More than once, stranded herself, she'd felt the relief of a stranger's help. Now, the silhouette she saw, waving frantically beside a stalled sedan, looked like a young woman in desperate need. Cassidy's 18-wheeler rumbled onto the shoulder, its massive frame trembling as she engaged the hazard lights. She climbed down, the damp mountain air instantly chilling her skin, ready to offer mechanical salvation. But as she approached the sedan, a disquiet began to gnaw at her. The car was pristine, a dark, gleaming enigma without a scratch or a dent, no hint of a breakdown. And the woman, her clothes, her hair, were bone dry, defying the thick, weeping fog that had drenched everything else for hours. A grateful smile, too wide, too fixed, stretched across the woman's face as she approached. She explained her car had broken down, pleading for a ride to the nearest town to call for help. Her story was plausible, her distress seemingly genuine. Yet something was fundamentally wrong. Her voice was flat, devoid of the very urgency her supposed predicament demanded. And her eyes, they remained unblinking, unmoving, like polished glass, utterly disconnected from the pleasant mask she wore. It was the smile of a mannequin, pleasant and dead. Cassidy, her instincts screaming, offered her CB radio for roadside assistance. The woman refused, her smile never wavering, insisting she only needed a ride. Against the cold logic whispering in her mind, Cassidy agreed. Leaving anyone stranded on these treacherous roads at night felt irresponsible, a betrayal of her own code. It was just a few miles out of her way, a small detour for a desperate soul. The woman settled into the passenger seat without another word, hands folded neatly in her lap, eyes fixed straight ahead through the windshield as if anticipating a journey far longer than a few miles. The heavy fog pressed around them, turning the narrow beam of Cassidy's headlights into a feeble probe. Cassidy tried to pierce the silence, asking about the woman's origins, her reason for being in this remote Blue Ridge section. The responses were vague, inconsistent, like fragments of a forgotten dream. One moment she claimed a town Cassidy knew didn't exist. The next, she spoke of landmarks hundreds of miles away. Most unnerving were the moments when the woman would turn, those doll-like eyes boring into Cassidy's profile, studying every curve, every shadow, as if cataloging her for some unknown purpose. After 10 miles of this disquieting companionship, with no sign of civilization, Cassidy's suspicion solidified into a cold dread. The woman hadn't once checked the time, asked about their destination, or shown any of the normal anxieties of someone truly stranded. Then, a quick glance in her rearview mirror. The sedan, the one they'd left behind, had vanished. The shoulder was empty, swallowed by the fog. Cassidy knew then. She had to end this. At the next rest area, a desolate patch of gravel carved into the mountainside, she pulled over. "This is as far as I can take you," she announced, her voice steadier than her heart. I have a scheduled stop." The woman, still smiling, simply said she understood. As she stepped out, she turned, her "thank you" a chilling caress. Her voice had deepened, blooming with a resonant harmony, as if several unseen throats whispered in unison through hers. Cassidy floored it, the big rig protesting as she accelerated away, her eyes glued to the rear view. No sign of the woman. For a brief moment, she almost believed it was over. But then, a pair of crimson pinpricks coalesced in her mirrors, keeping perfect pace. Despite barreling through curves and over hills at highway speeds, they remained, impossibly, at eye level. They were behind her, pulse-like, a rhythmic glow. Sometimes they'd dip out of sight, lost to a bend in the road, only to reappear, unwavering. And occasionally she swore she could discern the dark, indistinct silhouette of a human form wrapped around them, running, with glowing red eyes. For 40 agonizing miles, the lights pursued her, sometimes a glimpse, sometimes a sustained glare. The impossible pace, the unwavering distance, through terrain that would break any mortal runner. When she finally reached her destination, backing up to a well-lit loading dock, she expected them to vanish. But they didn't. They hovered at the periphery, just beyond the sodium vapor lamps, pulsing like the eyes of a patient predator. Cassidy, rattling through her delivery, felt their gaze on her back. She rushed, desperate to break free. As soon as she cleared the city limits, heading back into the mountains, they reappeared. This time she tried zigzagging, taking different highways, obscure back roads. It made no difference. The lights seemed to anticipate her every turn, sometimes appearing ahead of her, as if they knew a shortcut through the very fabric of the forest. The stalking continued for 3 more nights, a terrifying ritual. They would appear in the remote sections of the Blue Ridge, only to recede when she hit the populated zones. Each night, they appeared earlier, stayed longer, their confidence blooming into aggression. Cassidy, sleep-deprived and frayed, jumped at every shadow, her gaze constantly darting to her mirrors. On the 4th night, they breached the sanctuary of her cab. She first saw them in her peripheral vision, 2 red reflections in her side window as she scaled a steep, densely forested grade. Someone sitting right beside her. But when she snapped her head around, the passenger seat was empty, only the inky blackness beyond the glass. The lights now appeared everywhere, in her mirrors, in her windows, sometimes seemingly from directly behind her head, as if something leaned over her shoulder, watching the winding road ahead through her own eyes. The final confrontation erupted at a scenic overlook. Cassidy, engine idling, had pulled over seeking a moment's respite, a rational explanation. Then, 2 malevolent crimson glows materialized directly in front of her windshield, floating at eye level 10 feet away. An intelligence, unmistakably sinister, burned within them. As she watched, paralyzed, they began to drift closer, accompanied by the grit of footsteps on gravel. A shadow detached itself from the deeper darkness, a figure that was fundamentally wrong, a twisted mockery of human form. It was the woman. But her proportions were hideous, stretched, distorted, as if assembled from imperfect, second-hand memories of anatomy. Limbs too long, head cocked at an unnatural angle, and those red eyes, alien fire burning within them. It reached the truck, placing hands too large, too gnarled against the windshield, pressing close. A mouth opened, revealing teeth too sharp, too many, for any human. Cassidy slammed the rig into gear, peeling away from the overlook. Yet, the creature kept pace, running effortlessly alongside, a fluid, unnatural grace to its movements. Through her side window, its face was turned toward her, those burning red eyes blazing with hunger, its mouth stretched in a rictus grin that promised oblivion. Claws scraped against the metal, a horrifying symphony as it tried to wrench open her door. Cassidy fought the wheel, wrestling the truck through the serpentine mountain road, the creature's impossible pursuit a suffocating horror. After several miles, it suddenly vanished, falling behind as though dissolving into the very air. Cassidy was left alone on the dark highway, her heart a frantic drum, her hands shaking uncontrollably on the steering wheel. She drove straight to the nearest truck stop, stumbling inside to call her dispatcher, a trembling lie about needing emergency medical leave catching in her throat. Cassidy never drove the Blue Ridge Parkway alone again. The solitude, once a comfort, had become a predator. She never again stopped for a stranded motorist or offered a ride to a hitchhiker, the memory of that fateful kindness a brand upon her soul. She eventually traded the whispering pines for the cacophony of the city, a place where the asphalt pulsed with endless traffic and the stars were drowned by a sea of artificial light. Urban sprawl became her shield, its restless energy a constant ward against the creeping darkness. Yet the old fear lingered. Even in the city's heart, sleep offered no true escape. Those spectral red eyes, burning through the mountain fog, still haunted her dreams, their silent pursuit a relentless echo. And sometimes when the city lights receded behind her on an isolated stretch of road, a cold tremor would seize her. Her eyes would dart to the rearview mirror, checking obsessively for any pinpricks of red reflecting in the glass, any indication that the unseen hunter had finally caught up. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that whatever had stalked her through those ancient mountains hadn't finished its game. It had marked her, learned her rhythm, absorbed her scent, and was simply waiting for its moment, the perfect opportunity to resume the hunt that had begun with her simple act of mercy towards a traveler who was not what she seemed. In her most terrifying nightmares, Cassidy saw it clearly. The creature, a twisted parody of a lost soul, standing beside broken-down vehicles on desolate highways, waving frantically, its silent invitation a lure for the next unsuspecting Samaritan. She could almost taste the fear of those who would inevitably stop. A chilling question gnawed at her. How many other truckers, how many weary travelers had seen those same red eyes flicker in their mirrors? How many had desperately tried to outrun something that defied the laws of physics, something that was an extension of the darkness itself? And how many, she wondered, had simply vanished into the fog-shrouded peaks, swallowed by a landscape where the veil between the living and the monstrous thinned with every mile of darkened highway?